In the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire stood as the most powerful and awe-inspiring civilization the world had ever seen. Its marble cities gleamed under the Mediterranean sun, its legions kept peace from Britannia to the Euphrates, and its roads carried goods and ideas across 3 continents. At the heart of this vast empire was Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, whose writings would inspire generations long after Rome's glory had faded. He was a man of contemplation and wisdom, a ruler who tried to live by the Stoic ideals of duty, justice, and reason. And yet in one fateful decision, Marcus Aurelius would set into motion the events that would plunge Rome into chaos. The boy who would become Commodus was born in 161 AD into an atmosphere of privilege and expectation. The imperial palace was his playground, a place where senators bowed as he passed, and slaves hurried to obey his every command. From the moment he could walk, he was treated not merely as a child, but as the embodiment of Rome's future. Tutors instructed him in philosophy, rhetoric, and the art of war, while his father sought to shape him into a wise and disciplined ruler. But the boy's restless spirit resisted such molding. He was fascinated less by the scrolls of philosophy than by the spectacle of gladiators training in the courtyard, by the glitter of swords and the roar of the crowd. As Commodus grew older, the contrast between father and son became painfully clear. Marcus Aurelius spent long nights writing meditations on duty and the impermanence of life, while his son lounged in the baths or practiced with wooden swords, imagining himself as Hercules reborn. The emperor, though stern, was not unloving. He brought the boy with him on his campaigns along the Danube, hoping that the hardships of military life would teach him discipline and responsibility. But the bloody reality of frontier warfare did not sober the young prince. It thrilled him. He watched legionaries clash with Germanic tribes, saw prisoners executed, and felt something stir within him, a hunger for power, for control over life and death. When Marcus Aurelius fell ill during the Marcomannic Wars, Commodus, barely 18, was named co-emperor. The transition of power was meant to be smooth, a moment of continuity for Rome. Soldiers cheered the young ruler, senators bowed in formal allegiance, and the empire held its breath, waiting to see whether the boy could match the greatness of his father. For a brief moment, hope flickered across the empire. Perhaps he would grow into the role, guided by his father's counsel and tempered by experience. But as Marcus Aurelius's health failed and death came on a cold March day in 180 AD, that fragile hope died with him. Commodus returned to Rome in triumph, not as a grieving son but as a victor, draped in purple and hailed as Augustus. His first act as sole emperor revealed much about his priorities. Rather than completing his father's near victory over the northern tribes, he quickly negotiated peace and left the frontier behind. To the soldiers, weary of years of war, this was a blessing. To Rome's generals and strategists, it was a dangerous mistake that left the empire's borders vulnerable. But Commodus did not care. He wanted to bask in the glory of the capital, to feel the adoration of the masses, to live as a god among men. Back in the imperial palace, Commodus shed the last pretense of republican tradition. He dismissed experienced advisors, replacing them with flatterers who told him only what he wished to hear. The Senate, once the respected partner of emperors, was now reduced to a ceremonial audience forced to praise every word he spoke. The court became a place of luxury and intrigue, where whispers could mean death, and where Commodus's moods dictated the fate of Rome. In the marble halls where Marcus Aurelius once debated philosophy with his advisors, there were now feasts, drunken revels, and endless spectacles arranged to delight the young emperor. It was in these early days of his rule that Commodus began to fashion his identity as something more than mortal. He commissioned statues of himself dressed as Hercules, draped in lion skins, clutching a massive club. He liked to gaze at these images, imagining himself as a demigod destined to rule not just Rome but the entire world. The citizens of Rome, who had been used to emperors that at least pretended to humility, began to whisper uneasily. The prince they had once hoped might follow in his father's footsteps now seemed intoxicated by power. The Colosseum became Commodus's favorite stage. At first he attended the games as emperors had always done, watching from the imperial box. But soon, simply watching was not enough. He wanted to be part of the spectacle, to feel the roar of the crowd as he struck down his foes. He trained with professional gladiators, perfecting his technique, and when the day came that he stepped into the arena dressed as Hercules, the people of Rome gasped. No emperor had ever done such a thing. It was thrilling and terrifying at once. The Senate saw it as a disgrace to imperial dignity, but the crowd, at least at first, was delighted. Here was an emperor who fought for their entertainment, who bled as they bled, even if the opponents he faced were wounded slaves armed with wooden swords. Yet beneath the cheers, a darker current was growing. The careful balance of Rome's government was being undone, replaced by the whims of a single man. Senators feared for their lives, generals resented the abandonment of the frontier, and even common citizens began to wonder whether their emperor's thirst for spectacle might lead Rome down a dangerous path. In the shadows of the capital, unease was spreading like a slow-growing fire. Commodus, meanwhile, only felt more certain that he was destined for greatness. He renamed the months after his own titles, had the city of Rome renamed in his honor, and demanded that senators and officials worship him as a living god. For him, this was not arrogance but destiny, the natural order of things. The philosopher's son had become something else entirely, a ruler who believed that he was no longer bound by the laws of men, or even by the limits of mortality. And Rome, still glittering but now trembling beneath the weight of its emperor's ego, stood on the brink of madness. The days after his father's death turned into a blur for Commodus. A haze of perfumed condolences, whispered flattery, and hidden daggers. He sat on the marble throne of the Palatine Palace for the first time, his back straight, hands gripping the lion armrests as if holding on to the empire itself. He was only 19, yet the fate of Rome rested upon his shoulders. The Senate assembled to greet him formally, their faces masks of deference, but Commodus could feel the weight of their gaze, measuring him, comparing him to Marcus Aurelius. He spoke the words his tutors had drilled into him, promises of stability, prosperity, justice. But behind the formal language, his mind raced. He remembered his father's last days, the fever, the desperate attempts of the physicians, the strange quiet in the tent the night Marcus passed away. Was it truly illness that claimed him, or something more deliberate? The doubt gnawed at him, a worm burrowing into his heart. After the formalities, Commodus withdrew to his private chambers. The room smelled of wax and laurel oil. He dismissed his attendants, save for Cleander, his trusted chamberlain. Cleander, sharp-eyed and smooth-tongued, knelt close and whispered of conspiracies already forming among the senatorial class. "They see you as a boy," Cleander murmured, "but we will show them you are a lion." His words were poison wrapped in silk, and Commodus drank them eagerly. It was Cleander who suggested the first purge. A handful of generals, accused of treachery, were dragged before the young emperor. Commodus watched from a raised platform as the men pleaded for mercy. He said nothing, letting Cleander speak for him. When the executions were carried out, Commodus did not look away. Something inside him hardened that day, fear turning to grim resolve. Yet fear was never far. At night he dreamt of his father, pale and accusing, reaching out from the shadows of the tent. He awoke sweating, his pulse racing, and would wander the corridors of the palace, past the torchlit statues of gods and heroes. The faces of the marble emperors seemed to watch him, silent judges of his every choice. Then came the games. The Colosseum roared with life as Commodus appeared before the crowd. The air smelled of sweat, dust, and iron. Gladiators fought, lions leapt, and blood slicked the sand. Commodus sat forward on his gilded chair, his eyes wide. There was something intoxicating about the spectacle, the crowd's screams merging into one great voice that worshipped him. He felt power surge through him, raw and absolute. One afternoon, restless and fevered, he announced he would take part in the games himself. The Senate was horrified, but Commodus dismissed their protests. "Let Rome see their emperor as champion," he declared. He trained in secret, sparring with professionals, his lean frame growing harder with each day. When he finally entered the arena in armor of gold, the people went mad with delight. Commodus fought with theatrical flair, wounding but rarely killing, drawing out the spectacle to milk every cheer. The roar of the crowd drowned out the voice of his father in his mind. In the arena, he was not the frightened boy who sat alone in the night. He was Hercules reborn, the master of life and death. But with each victory, paranoia deepened. Cleander whispered that assassins were everywhere, even among the palace servants. Commodus ordered purges that grew ever bloodier, his dinners interrupted by sudden arrests, his halls echoing with the screams of the condemned. He began to wear armor even at banquets, a sword within reach as he ate. The young emperor, who once hesitated to give an execution order, now found solace in the power of fear. The court learned to smile and bow, to praise his strength, to tremble at his displeasure, and Commodus, feeling himself more god than man, began to dream of remaking Rome itself, not as the city of Marcus Aurelius, but as the city of Commodus. Rome awoke to a new emperor, but the city felt the tremors of change as Commodus's personality began to seep into every corner of the empire. Morning light spilled through the palace windows, illuminating a ruler whose gaze no longer wandered to counsel or philosophy, but to the reflection of his own ambition. He moved through the halls like a predator, each step deliberate, observing servants and senators alike. The court learned quickly. To attract favor, one must bow. To falter even slightly invited ruin. In the gardens of the Palatine, Commodus walked alone, contemplating the new vision of Rome he intended to enforce. He imagined himself not merely as an emperor, but as Hercules reborn, the divine arbiter of life and death. Statues of the old gods seemed to him like shadows of his own power, incomplete reflections of his intended grandeur. He summoned artists and sculptors, commanding portraits and statues that blended his visage with that of Jupiter, Mars, and eventually Hercules. Muscles exaggerated, expressions fierce, every eye fixed upon his divine authority. Yet even in his godhood, paranoia thrived. He suspected that the Senate, once loyal to Marcus Aurelius, now plotted quietly, their reverent smiles masking hidden daggers. Commodus began instituting subtle tests. Delayed responses to summonses were punished, whispers in the corridors were recorded and reported, and courtiers were forced to demonstrate extravagant public devotion. One senator, whose ancestors had long served Rome faithfully, was made to recite hymns in the emperor's honor while kneeling on the cold marble floor. A display of submission Commodus found deliciously satisfying. The games became increasingly personal. Commodus' obsession with the arena consumed him entirely. He trained for hours daily, imagining every blow as a testament to his divine nature. Lions were brought from Africa, tigers from India, and exotic beasts of every kind were captured at enormous cost to Rome's treasury. The people cheered, unaware of the strain upon their empire, dazzled by the display of their emperor's supposed invincibility. In private, Commodus practiced more brutal feats. Wrestlers bound and skilled were forced into staged contests to showcase his strength. He reveled not in their suffering per se, but in the affirmation of his own supremacy, each victory reinforcing the delusion that he was not merely human. Night brought no solace. Commodus often retreated to his private baths, the steam and warm water a mirror for contemplation. Here, he reflected upon the worship he demanded, the temples erected in his honor, the months renamed with his epithets: Commodus, Invictus, Exsuperatoris, Amazonius. Even Rome itself became Colonia Commodiana. Senators and generals alike trembled at the thought of speaking out. The cost of dissent was swift and brutal. Some were coerced into gladiatorial duels within the arena, their skill irrelevant, their fate predetermined. The emperor's satisfaction lay not in victory alone, but in the demonstration of absolute dominance over life and death. Despite the grandeur, cracks began to appear. Advisors whispered warnings of economic strain. Military leaders voiced concern over neglected frontiers, but Commodus brushed them aside. He saw them as pawns, temporary obstacles in the grand theater of his divinity. Cleander, ever faithful, manipulated these warnings to reinforce the emperor's fears and bolster his self-image. Every misstep of a subordinate, every slight hesitation was evidence of conspiracy. The empire's delicate balance, carefully maintained for centuries, teetered under Commodus's obsession with power and adoration. In the imperial palace, tensions boiled. Commodus began holding extended ceremonies in which senators and high-ranking officials were required to perform elaborate rites of obeisance. Failure to genuflect correctly, to speak with the proper reverence, or to display sufficient enthusiasm often resulted in exile or execution. This system of terror entrenched Commodus's control, but eroded trust and efficiency, leaving administrative offices hollowed out and dependent entirely on loyalty to a single man. The empire's vast machinery of governance faltered, running on fear rather than competence. Commodus's godhood extended to ritualized displays in public festivals. Traditional Roman ceremonies were altered to honor the living emperor. Provincial governors ordered to construct temples dedicated to him. Every festival became a reenactment of his exploits, every song a tribute to his divine strength. Citizens watched in awe and fear, uncertain whether to celebrate or tremble. The emperor's identification with Hercules became total. Lion skins, massive clubs, sculpted musculature, an aura of invincibility meticulously cultivated for maximum psychological impact. The more his delusions flourished, the more violent and irrational Commodus's behavior became. Courtiers found themselves humiliated, generals forced into dangerous games, and gladiators elevated to tools of political messaging. The line between performance and punishment blurred. In private, Commodus sometimes laughed as he watched the terror ripple across faces, delighting in the subtle ways fear could be administered. At the same time, he sought reassurance from Cleander and a few close attendants, constantly testing their loyalty through cryptic questions and abrupt commands. Yet the seeds of his undoing were already sown. Commodus' obsession with personal glory and divine imagery alienated competent advisors and commanders. The treasury drained, military readiness declined, and administrative function faltered. Behind the walls of marble and gold, conspiracies began to form among those who recognized the mortal dangers of a ruler untethered from reason. Commodus, wrapped in his self-created divinity, believed himself invincible, blind to the storm gathering at his back. By the end of the year, Commodus' Rome had transformed into a city reflecting a single man's ego. Majestic, terrifying, and fundamentally unstable. The emperor's face appeared on every coin, every arch, every statue. His voice dictated rituals, festivals, and the very months of the calendar. Yet the people began to whisper, soldiers hesitated at borders, and senators exchanged fearful glances. The empire's pulse quickened with anxiety. Its heart had become a mirror of Commodus's own ambitions, vast, golden, and dangerously fragile. As the months passed, Commodus's obsession with the arena grew into a central pillar of his reign. Each morning, the emperor awoke not to reports of governance or military strategy, but to the clamor of the amphitheater, imagining himself the star of Rome's most spectacular performances. His reflection in polished marble mirrored a man increasingly unrecognizable, the line between emperor and gladiator. Mortal and god blurred beyond distinction. In private chambers, Commodus meticulously planned each spectacle. Exotic beasts, captured at great expense from distant lands, were introduced into arenas with precise choreography. Lions from Africa prowled alongside tigers from India. Elephants moved with disciplined, unnatural grace. Commodus imagined each confrontation as a testament to his divinity. For him, the bloodless battles were sufficient, the illusion of risk confirming his godlike prowess. Servants and trainers executed his every whim, fearful of the consequences of misstep. One day he summoned a group of aging senators, men who had once advised Marcus Aurelius. Their task was simple: attend the arena as participants in a ceremonial event designed to glorify the emperor. Commodus watched with cold fascination as they performed under strict instructions, each gesture and step measured to highlight his supremacy. Though the contests were staged, the psychological pressure was immense. A single hesitation, a misstep could be fatal. The emperor's eyes glittered with satisfaction, not from cruelty alone, but from the affirmation of power and control. Outside the palace, the city of Rome began to feel the consequences of his obsession. The treasury strained under the cost of transporting, housing, and maintaining exotic beasts. Military resources were diverted to meet Commodus's desires, rather than securing the empire's frontiers. Governors and generals hesitated, unsure whether to prioritize imperial security or the emperor's whims. Public awe mingled with fear, and the once celebrated traditions of Roman life were transformed into a grand theater reflecting a single man's ego. Yet Commodus's godhood was not merely ceremonial. He began to identify himself fully with Hercules, wearing lion skins and wielding a massive club during the games. In private, he practiced feats of strength that no ordinary man could hope to match, pushing himself beyond mortal limits to reinforce the illusion of divinity. At night, he retreated to private baths or dimly lit chambers, reflecting on the control he wielded over life and death, over fear and admiration, over the empire itself. Every ripple of water, every shadow seemed to echo the power he imagined. The emperor's paranoia deepened alongside his delusions. He suspected conspiracies in the simplest gestures: a glance too long, a smile too hesitant, a bow too shallow. Senators whispered in hallways, soldiers hesitated at orders, courtiers calculated each word with care. Commodus demanded constant reassurance, surrounded himself with yes-men, and punished those who failed to meet his ever-shifting standards. The empire's administrative machine faltered, grinding under fear rather than efficiency. In the arena, the emperor staged his most elaborate performance yet, Slaves, prisoners, and professional gladiators were arranged to challenge him in mock combats, their weapons dulled, their movements restricted. The crowd cheered, believing in the emperor's invincibility, unaware of the careful orchestration behind every clash. Commodus's expression alternated between fury and triumph. Every movement, every swing of his club was calculated to reinforce the spectacle of godhood. Even as the games thrilled the people, the moral and economic decay of Rome accelerated unseen. Some generals attempted discreet counsel, warning of neglected borders and economic strain, but Commodus dismissed them as envious or treacherous. Cleander, ever astute, manipulated these warnings to tighten the emperor's dependency on his counsel, deepening both paranoia and self-aggrandizement. Commodus became increasingly isolated, reliant on those who reinforced his divine image rather than those who provided practical guidance. The empire's foundation, once solid, now trembled beneath a ruler enthralled by spectacle. Night brought further reflection and ritual. Commodus's baths were ritualized spaces of contemplation and rehearsal. Torches flickered against polished marble, casting long, shifting shadows. He would practice his gestures, rehearse speeches, and imagine every conceivable display of power. The distinction between performance and governance vanished. Each action, whether in public games or private meditation, was a piece of the same grand theater, the divine emperor asserting control over a mortal world. Despite the extravagance, whispers of discontent began to circulate. Senators and military leaders recognized the slow collapse of infrastructure, the financial strain, and the vulnerability of Rome's frontiers. Some feared that the emperor's obsession might lead to catastrophe, while others calculated that survival demanded obedience, however begrudging. The seeds of rebellion, small and tentative, began to take root, nourished by the recognition that Commodus's reign threatened not just comfort, but the very survival of the empire. In these moments, Commodus's inner world remained untouchable. He saw himself above consequence, a divine arbiter in an earthly realm. Yet even in the height of his delusion, the pressures of reality began to intrude. Rising costs, growing fear among subordinates, murmurs of rebellion. The god emperor's performance could not alter the material constraints of Rome, nor the human instincts of those around him. A tension began to mount, a precarious balance between spectacle and survival, between divine self-image and mortal reality. By the end of the year, the city had been reshaped into a stage for the emperor's ego. The amphitheater dominated public life. Festivals and rituals revolved around Commodus's divine image. Citizens, soldiers, and officials alike participated in the theater of madness, compelled by awe, fear, or survival instinct. Yet beneath the grandeur, the empire quivered. The people's devotion was coerced, loyalty enforced through fear. Commodus, immersed in his godhood, remained blissfully unaware that the cracks in his empire's foundations were widening, preparing the stage for betrayal, conspiracy, and the violent unraveling to come. By the 5th year of his reign, Commodus's delusions had grown into a full-fledged obsession with divinity and spectacle. Every citizen, soldier, and senator had been drawn into the emperor's theater, either as audience, participant, or instrument. Yet in the quiet corners of the palace, whispers began to gather like shadows, hints of unease and fear. Those closest to the emperor, slaves, chamberlains, and loyal generals, started to understand that the mad performances and rituals were more than mere vanity. They were symptoms of an unstable mind, capable of unspeakable cruelty. Latus, the Praetorian prefect, had watched the emperor carefully for years. Each grotesque display in the arena, each decree altering Rome's calendar or renaming cities and months, signaled a dangerous trajectory. Latus realized that Commodus's obsession with divine identification and public adoration was creating cracks in the empire, which, if unchecked, could lead to disaster. The wealth drained on exotic animals and theatrical spectacles diverted critical resources from frontier defenses. Generals grew frustrated. Governors flinched at orders, and the Senate, once a hub of debate and strategy, had become a stage for fear and flattery. Among those who feared the emperor's instability was Eclectus, the chamberlain, who had spent years managing the day-to-day administration of the palace. Observing the emperor's sudden mood swings and paranoid outbursts, she realized that even those who had enjoyed close personal favor were not safe. Her warnings were subtle, delivered in carefully measured tones, but she began to covertly organize intelligence on the emperor's movements, noting the patterns, his favorite routines, and moments of vulnerability. The conspiratorial seed was planted in silence, nurtured by the growing necessity of survival. One evening, Commodus decided to host a private feast, as was his habit. In his lavishly decorated private chambers, servants moved silently under torchlight, their expressions wary, while Commodus reclined, lion skin draped over his shoulders, a goblet in hand. The feast was both a performance and a test. Each gesture, every toast, every glance from his attendants was scrutinized. Commodus's eyes darted around the room, searching for signs of dissent, any hesitation seen as betrayal. It was in this atmosphere of fear that the conspirators began the delicate execution of their plan: poison the emperor, making death appear natural. Marcia, one of Commodus's closest concubines, had been drawn into the conspiracy not out of ambition, but necessity. Her name had recently appeared on one of the emperor's infamous lists, ensuring that proximity offered no protection. She administered a subtle dose of poison in the emperor's wine. At first he seemed to succumb. His face paled, hands trembled, and a wave of nausea overcame him. Yet the poison worked slower than anticipated. Commodus began to purge it violently, suspicion reigniting in his fevered mind. As he stumbled toward the private baths, weakened but still dangerous, the conspirators acted swiftly. Narcissus, a formidable wrestler and trusted agent of the plot, moved silently through the corridors, muscles coiled and senses alert. He understood the stakes. Failure meant death for everyone involved, but success would prevent further catastrophe. The emperor entered the warm, steam-filled bath, unaware of the figure approaching, still clinging to delusions of invincibility even as his strength ebbed. Commodus's reflection in the water showed a man who believed himself untouchable, a living god. Yet in that moment the illusion shattered. Narcissus struck with precision, wrapping his arms around the emperor and applying a chokehold. Commodus struggled, his voice echoing off marble walls, but the water masked his cries. The bath, once a sanctuary of divine reflection, became the final stage of his mortal existence. The emperor, whose life had revolved around dominance, spectacle, and terror, was finally rendered powerless. In the aftermath, Pertinax, a seasoned senator and former general, was presented with the purple as an alternative to further chaos. Understanding the enormity of responsibility, he accepted reluctantly. Aware of the fragility of the empire left behind, Rome itself exhaled uneasily. The public had witnessed neither noble justice nor heroic restoration, only the violent end of a man who had become a god to himself. The palace, now quiet, bore the lingering tension of fear and relief. Courtiers whispered, guards relaxed slightly, and those who had survived the emperor's madness began to contemplate the months and years ahead. Commodus's reign, though ended, left a trail of political instability, financial strain, and cultural distortion that would haunt Rome for years. Institutions that had endured centuries were weakened, the military mistrustful, and the Senate cautious, scarred by the theater of tyranny. Despite his death, the shadow of Commodus lingered. Tales of his divine fantasies, gladiatorial displays, and the cruelty masked behind performance spread throughout the empire. Rome was a city of awe and terror, admiration and horror, all bound together by the memory of a god emperor whose hubris had nearly consumed the civilization he was born to protect. Yet for those who had conspired against him, survival had come at a cost: constant vigilance, moral compromise, and the heavy weight of having taken a life not for glory but for necessity. As the sun rose on the first day of a new year, Rome was poised between memory and recovery. The people would continue to celebrate, fear, and perform under the remnants of a system that had been both magnificent and fragile. Commodus's legacy, horrifying and mesmerizing, became a cautionary tale of absolute power, unchecked ego, and the devastating consequences when a man's godhood eclipses the mortal world he governs. After Commodus's death, Rome teetered on the edge of uncertainty. Pertinax, though experienced and morally upright, stepped into a maelstrom of fear, instability, and corruption. The imperial treasury was nearly depleted, drained by years of the mad emperor's obsession with exotic games and self-aggrandizement. Soldiers, long pampered or neglected under Commodus's erratic commands, demanded pay and recognition, and many governors had grown accustomed to flattery and tribute rather than competent administration. Pertinax understood that the empire was fractured, and that his every decision would be scrutinized by those both loyal and opportunistic. The Senate, scarred by fear and survival instinct, approached the new emperor with a mix of hope and caution. They remembered the grandeur of Marcus Aurelius and the subsequent descent into tyranny under his son. Senators whispered behind closed doors, debating how to restore the balance of power without provoking rebellion. The shadow of Commodus hung over every conversation. His grotesque spectacles and arbitrary executions had reshaped the cultural memory of Rome. Pertinax, aware of this fragile environment, knew he had little room for error. Meanwhile, the Praetorian Guard, accustomed to the chaos and personal profit of the previous reign, remained a volatile force. Latus, who had orchestrated the death of Commodus with Narcissus and Marcia, now had to navigate the delicate balance of maintaining order while ensuring the Guard did not exploit the transition. Soldiers were restless, aware of the vacuum of authority and the potential for reward. Pertinax, drawing on his military experience, began to personally engage with commanders, listening to grievances, and demonstrating a measured but firm approach to leadership. Discipline needed to be restored, but heavy-handedness risked mutiny. Beyond politics, the citizens of Rome grappled with the psychological aftermath of Commodus's rule. The city had been reshaped by spectacles of terror. The calendar, streets, and festivals had been transformed to glorify a single, delusional man. Now, with him gone, there was a collective need to reclaim civic identity and restore traditional customs. Pertinax faced the delicate task of guiding Rome back toward stability while avoiding the pitfalls of vengeance. Temples, forums, and arenas bore silent witness to years of fear, and the cultural wounds were as deep as the political ones. Pertinax also contended with the empire's external threats. Barbarian tribes at the northern frontiers, previously neglected or pacified through Commodus's hasty treaties, began to probe for weaknesses. Trade routes, disrupted by years of mismanagement, needed reorganization. The Pax Romana, long considered unshakable, was now fragile. Yet Pertinax approached these challenges with cautious pragmatism. He prioritized strategic reinforcements, careful diplomacy, and the restoration of the administrative framework that had once made Rome efficient. Within the palace, conspirators who had orchestrated Commodus's downfall faced moral ambiguity. Latus, Narcissus, and Marcia, while relieved that their plan had succeeded, now lived under the constant tension of potential discovery. They had killed a living god in the emperor's own mind, but the empire's survival demanded their secrecy and discretion. Marcia, who had acted out of self-preservation, reflected on the cost of her actions, realizing that her role in the death of a tyrant was entangled with the collapse of familiar hierarchies and the forging of a new, uncertain order. Despite these challenges, Pertinax began to enact measures aimed at repairing both the political and cultural fabric of Rome. He reinstated traditional festivals, encouraged philosophical and civic discourse, and sought to balance the interests of the Senate, the military, and the people. It was a time of careful observation, subtle negotiation, and incremental reform, yet every step carried risk. The ghosts of Commodus's reign lingered in the minds of those who had been subjected to fear and spectacle. As months passed, Rome slowly regained a sense of cautious normalcy. Citizens returned to the streets and markets, armies were reorganized, and the Senate tentatively reasserted itself. Still, Pertinax's tenure was overshadowed by the fragility of his position. The Praetorian Guard, accustomed to manipulation and indulgence, remained a latent threat, and external pressures continued to challenge the stability he sought to restore. The lessons of Commodus's madness, of absolute power, paranoia, and spectacle remained etched into the consciousness of all who had survived. In the quiet of his chambers, Pertinax contemplated the enormity of his task. Rebuilding an empire was not merely a matter of finances or legislation, but of restoring trust, morality, and cultural memory. He understood that Rome's strength had always relied on its institutions, civic virtues, and disciplined legions. The experience of the past 12 years underscored the delicate interplay between leadership and accountability. Every decision, every decree, now carried the weight of restoring not only order, but dignity to a civilization that had been brought to the brink by the unchecked ego of a single man. Despite Pertinax's earnest attempts to restore order, the empire remained a precarious entity. The Praetorian Guard, though outwardly disciplined, retained an ingrained sense of entitlement and latent ambition. Soldiers, conditioned by Commodus's erratic rule, still expected immediate reward and feared any form of strict accountability. Their loyalty was transactional, contingent on favors, pay, and the emperor's presence. Pertinax knew that the shadow of unrest was never far, and that one misstep could ignite rebellion. He navigated the delicate balance of appeasing the guard while maintaining authority, often walking a tightrope of diplomacy, strategy, and subtle intimidation. In the Senate, whispers of discontent and caution intermingled. Some senators advocated bold reforms, eager to reclaim the integrity of Roman governance. Others, scarred by past violence and purges, hesitated, afraid to challenge even well-intentioned authority. Pertinax's presence alone, calm and measured, was a stabilizing factor. Yet he understood that appearances could only sustain temporary order. Behind the palace walls, factional alliances shifted constantly, as each individual sought to secure personal survival amidst fragile leadership. Externally, Rome faced renewed pressure along its frontiers. Tribes to the north and east, sensing opportunity, tested Roman defenses. Pertinax dispatched competent commanders to fortify strategic positions and reinvigorate the legion's discipline, emphasizing not only martial skill but adherence to Roman law and ethics. Trade routes, essential for revenue and supply, had been disrupted during Commodus's neglect, and restoring these networks required careful negotiation and the re-establishment of trust. Every diplomatic envoy, every supply caravan, represented a fragile thread upon which the empire's stability rested. Within Rome, citizens cautiously reclaimed civic life. Markets reopened, religious ceremonies resumed, and streets once filled with fear began to witness tentative joy. Yet the psychological scars of Commodus's reign were profound. The emperor's grandiose spectacles had twisted public perception of leadership and spectacle, conflating governance with personal entertainment and terror. Pertinax worked to redefine these associations, reinstating traditional festivals, public forums, and philosophical discourse, fostering a culture of civic responsibility rather than fear-induced adulation. Even within the palace, the conspirators who had orchestrated Commodus's death faced constant vigilance. Latus, Narcissus, and Marcia now operated under the weight of secrecy and morality, aware that their survival depended on discretion. The act of removing a tyrant, though justified in self-preservation, had permanently altered their relationships, reshaping trust and loyalty within the court. Marcia, in particular, grappled with guilt and the realization that personal survival sometimes necessitated morally ambiguous actions, a lesson ingrained by years of witnessing Commodus's tyranny. Pertinax himself confronted the delicate challenge of rebuilding institutional integrity. Roman governance had always relied on a balance between emperor, senate, and people. Under Commodus, that balance had been shattered. Pertinax's task was to re-establish it without provoking rebellion or chaos. He prioritized the reinstatement of experienced advisors, the reorganization of provincial administration, and the restoration of military discipline. Every decision required foresight, careful negotiation, and an understanding of human psychology, lest the empire descend once more into disorder. Throughout this period, subtle cultural restoration became as critical as political stabilization. Temples, arenas, and forums bore silent testimony to years of exploitation and fear. Pertinax encouraged the revival of philosophical schools, civic debates, and religious observances that emphasized community over personal glorification. He understood that Rome's strength lay not solely in its military or fiscal power, but in the resilience of its cultural and moral institutions. The psychological recovery of the populace, scarred by years of spectacle and terror, was central to long-term stability. As months progressed, Rome experienced a fragile equilibrium. Citizens cautiously engaged in civic life, soldiers adhered to renewed discipline, and the Senate tentatively resumed meaningful governance. Yet the ever-present threat of factionalism, rebellion, and opportunism loomed. Pertinax's leadership was defined by constant vigilance, tempered decisiveness, and the awareness that the fragile order he maintained could be shattered at any moment. The lessons of Commodus, of absolute power's ability to corrupt and destabilize, remained a guiding principle in every strategic choice. Pertinax reflected on the paradox of power. Authority could restore order, but it could also corrupt, and vigilance was the only safeguard against excess. He sought to create an empire where merit, law, and accountability prevailed over fear and spectacle. Yet even with disciplined legions, a wary senate, and cautious citizens, the empire's recovery was tenuous. Every corridor, forum, and battlefield carried echoes of the madness that had preceded him, reminding all of the thin line between civilization and chaos. In the quiet of the night, Pertinax contemplated the enormity of his mission. Rome's survival depended on restoring not just infrastructure and administration, but the very values that had once defined the city. Each decree, each strategic decision, each gesture toward the Senate or military was a deliberate act aimed at reinforcing stability. History had judged rulers by their capacity to balance power with wisdom. Pertinax, conscious of the lessons left by Commodus's reign, endeavored to embody this balance, knowing that failure would have consequences far beyond the palace walls. The tension in Rome reached a climax that no one could ignore. Pertinax's short-lived rule had restored a fragile stability, but the undercurrents of ambition and discontent remained potent. The Praetorian Guard, emboldened by years of Commodus's excess and accustomed to transactional loyalty, quietly debated the value of continued allegiance. Every soldier calculated risks and potential rewards, knowing that the throne was no longer an abstract symbol, but a prize tangible enough to seize. In the Senate, murmurs of unease persisted. Senators recognized the impermanence of any ruler who did not command absolute devotion from the military. The delicate web of politics, already strained, now threatened to unravel. Yet even as whispers of treachery floated in the corridors, Pertinax persisted in his mission to restore Roman institutions and reaffirm the sanctity of governance over spectacle. Daily life in the city seemed deceptively calm. Citizens went about their routines, attending markets, forums, and temples. The restoration of civic order and religious observance had brought a sense of normalcy, yet the memories of Commodus's tyranny lingered in every public square, every marble statue, every gladiatorial arena that no longer hosted displays of imperial cruelty. Families spoke in hushed tones, aware that even the smallest misstep could spark violence or punishment. The external threats, too, demanded attention. Northern tribes tested the empire's defenses with small raids, probing the limits of Rome's renewed military discipline. Pertinax responded with measured strategy, deploying legions to reinforce vulnerable positions while personally overseeing supply lines and fortifications. Diplomacy played a critical role alongside military might. Emissaries and envoys worked tirelessly to renegotiate treaties, restore disrupted trade, and build confidence among allied and conquered peoples. Every day was a battle fought with pens and swords alike, demanding wisdom, foresight, and constant vigilance. Despite these efforts, the Praetorian Guard's dissatisfaction grew. Pertinax's reforms curtailed the privileges and bonuses that had once been expected by soldiers accustomed to Commodus's indulgences. Personal loyalty was replaced by principles, and the enforcement of discipline challenged the Guard's sense of entitlement. Rumors swirled, and secret meetings were held under the cover of darkness. Within weeks, whispers became schemes, and the schemes became a conspiracy that would shake Rome to its foundations. Pertinax, despite his acute awareness of political fragility, underestimated the speed and decisiveness with which the Praetorian Guard could act. They had learned from Commodus's reign that power lay in muscle as much as in moral authority. The night of his assassination, December 28, 193 AD, was a culmination of calculated impatience and pent-up ambition. Soldiers entered the imperial chambers with minimal resistance. The very corridors he had carefully monitored became the stage for betrayal. Pertinax, confronted by the inevitability of his fate, faced the reality that wisdom and virtue alone could not protect him from the raw assertion of force. In the final moments, the emperor's reflection on Rome's precarious state was interrupted by sudden violence. Attempts to reason, to persuade, to appeal to honor proved futile. Pertinax fell swiftly, victims of the very system he had sought to stabilize. His death, though tragic, revealed the persistent fragility of institutions and the thin line separating authority from chaos. Rome had been restored, only to demonstrate that the structural weaknesses exploited by tyrants could claim even the most capable rulers. The city reacted with a mix of grief, fear, and anticipation. Citizens mourned the loss of a leader committed to justice and stability, yet they also feared the unknown consequences of such an abrupt transition. Senators scrambled to assert influence, while military commanders calculated their own positions in the emerging power vacuum. The precedent was clear. The throne could be seized through decisive action, irrespective of morality or legality. The cycle of ambition, rebellion, and violent succession had been firmly entrenched, a shadow stretching far into Rome's future. Despite the abrupt end, Pertinax's reforms left subtle imprints on the empire. Administrative structures once corrupted under Commodus were partially restored. Civic practices regained some integrity. Military discipline, though challenged, had been reinforced. These changes, though fragile, demonstrated that thoughtful leadership could influence the trajectory of the empire, even if temporarily curtailed by circumstance. Rome, as always, endured, carrying the lessons of power, corruption, and vigilance in its collective memory. In reflection, the story of Pertinax and the shadow of Commodus' tyranny underscored the cyclical nature of human ambition. Absolute power, when misused, could warp morality, culture, and society. Yet careful, principled leadership could temporarily restore balance. The impermanence of authority, the fragility of institutions, and the human tendencies toward self-interest and opportunism became central themes in the annals of Rome. History remembered the emperors not only for their actions, but for the enduring lessons their reigns provided to the civilization they sought to shape. As Rome moved forward, the memory of these tumultuous years, Commodus's excesses and Pertinax's fleeting restoration, served as both warning and guide. Future emperors would inherit not just territories and wealth, but the echoes of choices made, consequences endured, and the constant tension between human ambition and the greater good. The legacy of this era was a city forever vigilant, aware that power could be both a force of creation and a harbinger of destruction.